Otherwise, we'll give you a paper so that you can take notes as well. But we are going to be in the second session of our part 2, talking about relationships. Now, full disclosure, complete honesty. Like I mapped out all these lessons and kind of like put together like the theme and the series and like how we're going to build up the lesson throughout like the Christmas break. We did not pay attention to any dates or anything like that. And like I didn't say like, okay, this Sunday I want to talk about this. I was just kind of like, okay, this is the order I want to talk about it. Really, honestly, had no idea that we could be talking about relationships on Valentine's Day. So that was just like pure divine providence and all that we get to talk about that. But we're not going to be talking about like relationships in terms of like dating or anything, but relationships as a whole. As we have been talking about revival and even going into this next theme of like restoring ourselves and like restoring back to what we used to be. And we kind of talked about that when we think about revival and reviving what has been lost, it includes restoring things back to what they once were. Kind of looking at what ourselves were like, even if it's like the first time that we started believing in Jesus, the first time we encountered Jesus, a moment when like God just opened our eyes to a big thing that he is doing in our lives, and just restoring to that. And maybe like as we talked about last week, maybe like if you think a year ago, you had like really good spiritual habits. You were praying all the time, you were reading the Bible, meeting with friends, going to church a lot. But then throughout quarantine and COVID and all that, like you kind of just lost those habits. And we have all probably have those areas in our lives that we have struggled to let go, that we have struggled to like hold on to. So how do we restore back to that? And we talked about last week that really kind of starts with thinking about priorities. That we need to make God our priority and restore how we see the world through the way that we give God our attention. We talked about how there's a lot of times we are juggling different types of priorities. We have things that we're trying to keep up in the air, but there's also, as we are trying to juggle everything, certain parts of our lives get more attention than the other ones for whatever reason. And a lot of times that leads us to ignore the other important things in our lives, and especially we ignore God as we are trying to prioritize everything else, staying on top of schoolwork, trying to stay connected with our friends, trying to keep ourselves entertained. Like we just tend to forget that God is a presence in our lives, and we don't give him the attention that we are supposed to. But when that happens, we start to see the world through whatever our priority is, and we start interacting that way, and our lives loses its energy in its life because we are putting our priority and our attention into the wrong thing. And so that goes into our conversation about relationships. And a question I want to start off with you as you think about relationships in general, because probably one of the biggest things that have been impacted throughout this past year that has probably changed, evolved, looks different, obviously, for lots of many different reasons, are the ways that we connect with the people around us. Or even so, like being home 24/7 with your parents and like your siblings all the time, like I'm sure your relationship with them has changed, where you're just kind of like existing together, maybe. We hear all kinds of different stats and like facts and figures, but we have seen like the impact of how relationships have just really grown to be unhealthy and negative throughout this past year. Jen works in family law, and so like she is dealing with like this increase in like divorces and families that are being broken apart because of things that they have experienced throughout this year. Even at the early start of quarantine, like there's reports come from other countries that shut down before us that their divorce cases were increasing and families were falling apart because of that. Relationships being split and broken, not being able to see relatives, whatever. So you're feeling distant from there, not being able to see friends. There, we had a good group of friends, but like we hardly get to see. We haven't seen them in almost a year because of everything going on. And I'm sure that's the case for some of you. Like you had some really good friends that at school and that you would see and hang out with, but now you don't ever really talk to because you can't. We know that relationships have changed. I think if we were really honest with ourselves and like took the time to think about it, we could all agree on that. So here's a question I want to ask you. There should be some blank space in the back of the book. If you're using the book, you can use the back of the picture. Oh, there is not a blank space. But you can use the back. You can find an empty page, section, whatever. Here's what I want to ask you. Let's think of like this on a scale of 1 to 10. I want you to think of two numbers. And the question is, how has the health of your relationships grown throughout this past year? So here's what I want you to think about. Like for the first one, I want you to think about your family. And when I think about healthy relationships, what I mean by that is like, are you encouraging? Are you investing in each other well? Are you talking? Are you being positive, pushing each other towards a relationship with God? Or is it like negative and putting each other down all the time? And I know this might even go into some deeper parts that we may not even want to think about, but like when you think about your friends, like are they healthy? Are they pushing, is that a healthy relationship? Are they pushing you to be more like Jesus? Are they a positive influence? Do you feel good about yourself when you leave that relationship, like leave that space? And so it's a very vague term, I know. But think about this time last year. On a scale of 1 to 10, how healthy was your relationship with your family? And like positive and like influential and like a good place. And then think about it like today on a scale of 1 to 10, how healthy is your relationship with your family? So you'd have two numbers, and if it's gotten healthier, good, great. If it's gotten negative, it's fine. And you don't have to like label it. Nobody's gonna see this. This is just for you. So the first number, how healthy was your relationship with your family a year ago on a scale of 1 to 10? And today, how healthy is your relationship with your family? And then do the same thing for your friends. How healthy was your relationships with your friends a year ago? And how healthy is it today? And compare the two numbers. And then same thing with your spiritual life. How healthy was your relationship with God a year ago? And how healthy is it today? Scale of 1 to 10. And then I'm going to include this. This could be anything, like from people that you play with online, to people that you see in the store, or even like just talking to random people through like social media or whatever. How healthy is your relationship with strangers from a year ago to today? Because I know, like, as we've been online more, there's probably a lot more interactions we have with people that we don't know, or even as we interact with people in the store or whatever, like, we don't have a healthy view of them. And I want you to look at those numbers, and I want you to compare it, and like I want you to think about like really what has been the cause of that change, and really how has that affected you? Because as we have talked about, we had this lesson a couple months ago. Some of you may remember that we had this illustration that said that like we know relationships influence us. That as what is being poured into us by other people, by God, by whatever, that is what is being overflown into the other lives around us. And so we know that relationships, and we remember, if you remember that lesson, we know that relationships affect our lives and the people around us, because whatever's coming into us, if it's negative, then that brings us to a negative place. But then also what overflows out of us is a negative influence. And so we need to recognize, and as we think about how those numbers have grown and how healthy our relationships are with the people around us, with our family, friends, strangers, God, if that is unhealthy, then what we are putting out into the world is not healthy either. If what people are pouring into us is not healthy, then what we are pouring into the people back is not healthy either. And so it's that constant like cycle and overflow, that whatever's going in is what's coming out of us. And so if your relationships, as we think about what needs to be revived and how we are impacted and what has changed throughout this past year, and we let our relationships kind of get to this negative place, that like, yeah, you know what? I'm just not getting along with my friend, that's what it is, and I'm done. Or yeah, my family's not in a good place and we're just, we're not dealing with it. I'm not talking about it, I'm not asking for help, I'm not whatever. Or you know what, I've really kind of forgotten about God from where I was a year ago, and it's just what it is. And if it's not at a healthy place, then what we are putting out into the world, what we are trying to hold on to, what energizes us, is not healthy either. And we need to recognize and understand that truth. And there's this whole psychology to it, but I think if we just really pay attention and we understand when we are around certain people and they make us feel a certain way, that is what we put back. I mean, we've all experienced it. Like if you just had a bad day and you're bad day at school and you go home and your mom's just like, hey, how was your day? And you're like, it was fine. And you're just yelling at them all of a sudden. Like we just know, because that's how we are impacted. And it's the same thing how relationships work, that people are negative to you, you feel negative about yourself, and you put negativity out into the world. And so as we think about that, and especially as we think about what we talked about last week, having God as your priority changes how you view and invest in your relationships. I mean, I talked about last week, and I'm not going to put balloons up to my eyes again, but we said that as something becomes your priority, that becomes your perspective, right? And so, like, using sunglasses as an illustration, because, again, I'm not putting balloons up to my eyes, and plus, this looks a lot cooler, you know? Whatever. Hey. I don't know why I did that. So ignore that. Slave. But think about it. So if this is your priority, and like, you know how sunglasses or like any like thing that you put in front of your eyes changes your perspective, and like this is how you view the world. And the priority that you put your attention on changes how you view the world. And last week we talked about making God your priority. Then as we think about our relationships, and you are looking at your relationships through the perspective of your priority, which should be God, then that is how we bring life and invest in the relationships around us in a godly, spiritual way. That we make sure that we relate to people through the priority of God. That instead of looking at people through selfish reasons, that you know what, you're just my friend because I feel like you're popular and it makes me more popular if I'm with the popular kid and whatever, and like I know you're making bad decisions, but I'm gonna make the bad decisions with you because I want you to like me and whatever, and like in your priorities, attention and popularity and acceptance, then the relationships we invest in and pursue go through that perspective, and that's how we invest in those relationships. If, as I said last week, if your perspective and your priority is money, then your relationships will be built on and focused on helping you make sure you have money in your life, or to feel like that you have money. That changes your perspective and how you relate to the people around us. And so if God is your priority, then the people that you have relationships with, whether it's the family that you're tired of being around, the siblings who are just driving you crazy, the friends that you have forgotten about, the strangers that you encounter at the store in a time when we feel unsafe with strangers, seeing them as God changes how you relate to them and how you invest in those relationships. And we see this in Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24, where we are being told how we should have that perspective, that godly perspective for the relationships of our lives. And it says, let us be concerned about one another in order to promote love and good works, not staying away from our meetings as some habitually do, but encouraging each other all the more as you see the day drawing near. We see this encouragement and this pushing towards grace. He talks about the day drawing near, talking about the day of like experiencing God's glory and his grace, that we keep encouraging and doing our best in whatever relationship we have to make sure people see the love and encouragement and the power of God in our lives, because that is our perspective. I mean, our relationships, I don't know how your relationships are going, like with your family, with your friends, or like, and I know there's some big things that we need to like, could probably unpack and talk about. But at the base level, when we think about the people in our lives, we need to approach them and invest in them, make sure that what we are pouring into them comes from encouraging them to grow closer to God. And then in other terms, if we can't do that, if we can't push people to God, if they can't push us to God, then that goes back to what we talked about a few weeks ago, where we need to really decide, is this what I need in my life? Is this what I need to hold on to, or is this what I need to move away from? And then that's where you get into the community where you look for help and come to us and talk about it and see what can we do to make sure God is a priority and that those relationships are bringing life and closer and a closeness to God. Our relationships have changed. They have been impacted for so many different ways. But what we need to understand, my thing died, but is that when we change our perspective on relationships and how God works in those relationships, it brings revival and restoration back to how we interact with others. Whether that changes how we pour God into their lives, how we make sure that we are surrounded by people who are pouring God into our lives, or we make the hard decisions to say, hey, you know what? You are not good for me, so let's move on. when you are looking at relationships through the perspective of encouraging and pushing people towards God, that is where revival comes from. And that's where restoration within our hearts and our connections with other comes from. So I pray for that with you, whatever relationships you are going into. If you need to talk about it, because I know that's a bigger thing, and like there are lots of things happening, like with friends and families and just everything right now. Talk to us. We are a relationship that you can count on, that we want to push you closer to God, and we are here for you for that. But if anything, go home looking at your family, your friends, anybody that you interact with today, saying that, okay, this relationship, God needs to be a part of this. What can I do to make that happen? Let's pray.